The threshold no longer moved like a station at peace. Bastian noticed it immediately, the next cycle. The changes were subtle at first glance. Corridor lighting had shifted toward emergency conservation levels across non-essential habitation sectors. Pilgrimage traffic routes had been rerouted through narrower transit arteries. Security partitions sealed portions of the lower synchronization halls entirely behind pale containment fields that had not existed the previous evening. But the greater change lived in the people. Curator personnel moved faster now, not openly frantic. That would have violated half the station's cultural conditioning. Still, the illusion of calm had begun developing fractures around the edges. Voices lowered automatically whenever conversations approached harmonic systems. Operational crews clustered too closely around relay panels. Analysts reread synchronization data they normally would have trusted instinctively, and everywhere beneath it all lingered the same incomplete rhythm inside the threshold itself. Benedictio Nonus remained silent. Bastian stood inside one of the upper operational galleries overlooking the primary synchronization chamber, while containment directives continued unfolding across surrounding projection fields in pale gold-white streams of light. Restricted harmonic access. Pilgrimage delays authorized, sector-wide verification pending. External transmissions subject to Synod review. The language remained procedural, almost gentle. That frightened him more than open alarm would have. Institutions only sounded calm like this when they were buying time. Selene entered the gallery several minutes later carrying a stack of manually printed harmonic records beneath one arm. Bastian noticed the paper immediately. No digital transfer? Restricted under containment authorization. That was fast. Selene crossed toward the central console beside him. The Synod transmitted emergency procedural authority less than an hour ago. Bastian watched new synchronization restrictions unfold across the chamber below. They moved quickly. They remember antiphon vigil. The answer settled quietly between them. Not accusation, not defense. Recognition. Below the gallery, dozens of harmonic analysts moved through overlapping projection fields while synchronization equations updated continuously across the chamber air. The threshold's central resonance systems compensated endlessly around the missing choir source, recalculating corridor strain distributions faster than human cognition could comfortably follow. Humanity had never truly built systems like these. The earliest interstellar worlds had expanded outward through corridors the Maiar left behind, inheriting harmonics they barely understood and mistaking successful operation for mastery. The station was adapting. Bastian hated how normal that already looked. Selene placed the printed records against the console surface beside him. Long-range verification relays still show no response from Benedictio Nonus. Bastian said nothing. Selene studied him briefly before continuing. The Synod believes the source may have experienced temporary harmonic collapse. No. You answered very quickly, because the lattice compensation patterns already stabilized around permanent absence assumptions. Selene looked back toward the synchronization chamber below. You sound certain. I sound familiar with systems trying to survive impossible conditions. The words arrived colder than he intended. Selene did not respond immediately. Bastian regretted the tone almost at once. Not because it was unfair, because he knew she understood exactly what he meant. Movement below the gallery drew both their attention. Several representatives from the Meridian Institute had entered the lower operational levels, accompanied by threshold security personnel. Their dark civilian survey coats contrasted sharply against the layered ceremonial vestments worn by the curator officials surrounding them. Even at this distance, tension shaped the way the groups moved together. Controlled, polite, adversarial. They're here earlier than expected, Selene said quietly. They noticed the corridor fluctuations. The Synod hoped the synchronization delays would conceal that. Bastian almost laughed. The Meridian Institute maps deep sector harmonic drift independently. They were always going to notice. One of the Meridian representatives stopped near the lower synchronization arrays and began speaking sharply with a Curator oversight official. Their voices did not reach the upper gallery, but posture carried enough meaning. The Curators were refusing access. The Meridian personnel already suspected why. Another harmonic fluctuation moved through the threshold beneath their feet. Subtle, brief, still enough for nearby projection fields to flicker softly across the chamber. Conversations below paused almost simultaneously, then resumed, too quickly. Everyone aboard the station had begun pretending not to notice things. Bastian recognized that behavior too. Selene rested one hand lightly against the gallery railing. Most of the station personnel still don't know what happened. They know something happened. That isn't the same thing. No, Bastian agreed quietly. It never is. Below them, one of the synchronization analysts hurried between console tiers carrying manually isolated relay data instead of transmitting it digitally through the station lattice. Containment inside containment. Cold settled deeper inside Bastian's chest. The Curators were already beginning to compartmentalize internally. Not everyone aboard the threshold would be allowed to know the truth. Not even now. Selene followed his gaze downward. The Synod's afraid. Bastian watched the lower chamber in silence. Yes. Another pause. Then, they may have reason to be. The threshold vibrated unevenly beneath the gallery floor. Not enough for panic, enough for memory. Bastian closed his eyes briefly. He could still remember evacuation projections unfolding across Antiphon Vigil System displays 10 years earlier. The impossible mathematics, the denial, the gradual realization that institutions had mistaken delay for control until the collapse became irreversible, and afterward, people screaming through overloaded transit corridors while stabilization systems failed faster than civilian movement could adapt. The memory vanished as quickly as it surfaced. Bastian opened his eyes again. Below the gallery, the Meridian representatives had finally been escorted away from the synchronization chamber access points. Denied. For now. Selene watched them leave. They won't stop asking questions. No. The Synod will delay disclosure as long as possible. Yes. Selene looked toward him carefully. And you? Bastian did not answer immediately, because he already knew what frightened him most. Not the silence itself, not the possibility of systemic collapse, the familiarity, the unbearable sense that civilization had arrived once again at the exact same decision point. Tell people the truth and risk panic, or contain the truth and pray reality remained patient long enough to survive the delay. A new harmonic projection unfolded suddenly across the upper gallery displays. Local corridor instability detected. Sector realignment in progress. Bastian looked toward the synchronization lattice automatically. Tiny strain fractures had begun spreading farther outward from the absence surrounding Benedictio Nonus, small enough that most personnel might not notice the pattern yet. But they were growing. The threshold adjusted around them immediately, compensating, redistributing, normalizing. Cold moved through him, because systems only normalized instability when they expected instability to continue. The diplomatic chamber overlooked one of the threshold's outer transit corridors. Beyond the towering observation windows, stabilized space curved faintly around the station in pale harmonic distortions. Pilgrimage routes, normally visible as soft resonance traces through the dark, now flickered intermittently as corridor recalibrations continued spreading outward from the silence surrounding Benedictio Nonus. Even the stars beyond the glass seemed less trustworthy than they had the previous day. Bastian stood near the rear of the chamber while Curator officials arranged themselves around the central negotiation tiers with practiced ceremonial precision. Everything remained orderly. That frightened him too. The chamber itself had been designed to communicate permanence, Pale vaulted walls curved upward around suspended harmonic lanterns, while resonance inscriptions shimmered softly beneath the polished floor panels. The threshold's low harmonic pulse moved faintly through the room beneath the silence between conversations. Incomplete now. Bastian doubted anyone inside the chamber could stop noticing it anymore once they had felt the absence consciously. Selene stood several meters away beside one of the lower diplomatic consoles, reviewing updated synchronization reports. The exhaustion around her eyes had become slightly more visible during the last several hours. Neither of them mentioned it. The Meridian delegation entered under escort shortly afterward. 5 representatives crossed the chamber together, wearing dark civilian survey attire marked only with subtle silver insignia along the collars and sleeves. Unlike the curators, the Meridian Institute favored minimal ceremonial distinction. Their clothing emphasized utility rather than inherited hierarchy. Bastian recognized one of them immediately. Director Caelum, senior harmonic astrophysicist, former Synod initiate. One of the few secular researchers influential enough that the curators could not easily dismiss him publicly. Vey's gaze moved briefly across the chamber before settling on Bastian near the rear observation tier. Recognition appeared instantly, not surprise, concern. The curator delegation began the proceedings almost immediately. Director Vey, said Oversight Prelate Enner from the central platform. The threshold remains operational. Current pilgrimage delays are precautionary, while local resonance verification continues. Verification of what? Vey asked calmly. A minor synchronization. Irregularity. Vey glanced once toward the corridor projections visible beyond the observation windows. With respect, Prelate, our survey arrays independently recorded 3 regional lattice compensations within the last 6 hours. The chamber grew slightly quieter afterward, not because anyone doubted the statement, because everyone understood what it implied. The Meridian Institute had already observed enough to recognize that this exceeded ordinary corridor instability. Enor folded his hands carefully before answering. Independent observations often lack contextual harmonic interpretation. Then provide context. We are still assessing the situation. You are restricting external transmission access across 4 neighboring sectors. No one answered immediately. Bastian watched the surrounding curator officials carefully. None appeared surprised the Meridian Institute had discovered the restrictions so quickly. Only displeased. Director Vey stepped closer toward the central projection tiers. If a choir source has destabilized, it has not, Enor interrupted smoothly. Vey held his gaze. Then you will have no objection to independent harmonic verification. That authorization is not currently available. The words remained perfectly polite, which made the refusal feel even more absolute. Outside the observation windows, one of the distant transit corridors flickered faintly across stabilized space before correcting itself again. Several people in the chamber noticed. No one acknowledged it aloud. Bastian could feel the threshold compensating beneath the diplomatic tiers even here. Tiny redistributions moved continuously through the harmonic lattice now, subtle adjustments spreading farther outward every hour. The station was working harder, trying to preserve the illusion of continuity. No civilization since the extinction of the Mire had ever reproduced choir harmonics independently. Humanity's empire existed because ancient stars still answered instructions written by the dead. Director Vey looked toward the corridor distortions beyond the glass before speaking again. The Meridian Institute maintains 32 independent harmonic observatories beyond curator-administered sectors. Enor remained silent. We know something fundamental has changed. The chamber's harmonic lanterns dimmed fractionally overhead. Briefly, then stabilized again. One of the curator analysts near the rear console tiers lowered his gaze almost immediately afterward. The movement revealed more fear than any spoken reaction would have. Selene finally stepped forward from the lower synchronization console. Director Vey, she said carefully, Premature disclosure without verified understanding could destabilize regional transit confidence unnecessarily. They turned toward her. And delayed disclosure? Selene hesitated, only slightly. May prevent panic while verification continues. Bastian watched the exchange in silence. The argument sounded painfully familiar already. Vey studied Selene for several seconds before answering. Civilizations built entirely on public confidence become fragile long before anyone notices. The words settled heavily through the chamber. Because everyone present understood the accusation beneath them. The choir had never merely been infrastructure. It was psychological certainty, inherited permanence, proof that civilization remained stable because the stars themselves remained stable. And now, one of those stars had gone silent. Enor straightened slightly at the center platform. The Synod will release verified information once the situation has been properly assessed. Director Vey's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. With respect, Prelate, the universe rarely waits for institutions to become emotionally comfortable before reality continues. The chamber fell still after that. Even the surrounding harmonic systems seemed quieter. Bastian almost smiled despite himself. Not because the statement was satisfying, because it sounded exactly like something he would have said 10 years earlier. And that realization terrified him. Enor's voice remained calm. The Meridian Institute is requested to suspend independent harmonic publications until formal assessment concludes. One of the Meridian representatives gave a short, disbelieving laugh before suppressing it immediately. Vey never looked away from the Curator delegation. You're asking for informational containment. We are requesting procedural discipline. You're afraid. The words landed softly. No accusation, only observation. No one answered him. Because denial would have sounded dishonest now. Outside the observation windows, another corridor fluctuation rippled briefly through stabilized space. Longer this time, the corridor dimmed almost to invisibility before slowly reforming inside the surrounding harmonic lattice. Several Curator personnel looked toward it automatically. Bastian noticed how quickly they looked away afterward, like acknowledging instability directly might encourage it somehow. Director Vey followed the movement beyond the glass carefully. Then his attention returned to Bastian, not the Curators. Bastian realized the reason immediately. Vey already knew who aboard the threshold would recognize what this meant. The older scientist crossed the chamber slowly after the formal proceedings dissolved into strained procedural discussion around them. Neither Curator security nor diplomatic officials attempted to stop him, not openly. Supervisor Kane, Vey said quietly once he approached the rear observation tier. Bastian inclined his head slightly. Director. Vey studied him carefully. You've seen the synchronization lattice personally. Yes. And? Bastian remained silent for several seconds. Beyond the windows, the unstable corridor shimmered faintly against surrounding darkness. The threshold continued compensating beneath their feet, always compensating. Finally, Vey spoke again. If the choir can fail once, he said quietly, every independent observatory in human space will eventually notice. Bastian looked toward the diplomatic chamber around them. The Curators still spoke in calm, restrained tones, still trying to contain uncertainty through language, still behaving as though time remained negotiable. And suddenly he understood something with terrible clarity. Containment timelines were already collapsing faster than the Synod realized. They simply had not admitted it to themselves yet. The lower resonance archives lay beneath the oldest sections of the threshold. Most station personnel never entered them. Even many Curators assigned aboard the threshold spent entire careers without authorization to access the deeper harmonic vaults hidden beneath the synchronization sectors. The lower archives contained obsolete resonance notation, pre-standardized lattice records, and inherited harmonic studies dating back centuries before modern transit codification. The Curators preserved everything, whether they understood it or not. Bastian descended through 3 restricted transit lifts alongside Selene while authorization sigils unfolded silently across the lift walls around them. The deeper levels of the station felt older in ways architecture alone could not fully explain. The harmonic vibrations changed, subtler, less regulated, like listening to a familiar language spoken in an older accent. Neither of them spoke during the descent. The events inside the diplomatic chamber still lingered between them. Not disagreement exactly, recognition. The lift finally settled into the archive levels with a soft mechanical pulse. The corridor beyond stretched into dim, gold-white illumination beneath curved stone vaulting older than most inhabited planetary governments. Ancient harmonic inscriptions shimmered faintly along the walls, their notation patterns denser and less standardized than modern curator systems. Some symbols Bastian recognized only partially, others not at all. The air smelled different here, cooler, dustier, like sealed time. Automated archive systems still operated silently beneath the age of the chamber around them. Deep within the walls, ancient indexing machinery emitted soft mechanical pulses while suspended harmonic storage lattices glimmered faintly through recessed alcoves extending deeper into the vaults. Selene studied the surrounding inscriptions as they walked. "I've never been this far below the threshold. Most navigators haven't. Have you?" "A few times." Selene glanced toward him. "You sound disappointed by how unimpressive that answer was." Bastian almost smiled. Almost. The archive corridor opened eventually into a circular harmonic repository chamber layered with descending console tiers surrounding a central resonance column. Pale harmonic light rotated slowly upward through the center of the room, illuminating thousands of suspended storage filaments drifting motionless through the chamber air. The systems here predated modern synchronization architecture entirely, which was precisely why Bastian trusted them more. Humanity's first interstellar worlds had not crossed the stars through human invention. They had followed corridors the Maior left behind, learning slowly how to survive inside systems no living species had ever reproduced successfully. Modern curator systems filtered and standardized historical data aggressively. The older repositories preserved contradictions modern archivists no longer considered useful or safe. Selene crossed slowly toward the central resonance column while Bastian activated one of the lower archive consoles manually. "You think this happened before?" she said quietly. Bastian keyed authorization sequences into the ancient interface. "I think civilizations inherit more mysteries than they admit publicly." "That isn't an answer. It's the only honest one I have right now." The archive systems responded slowly. Older processing lattices awakened beneath the chamber floor, while suspended harmonic filaments brightened gradually around them. Ancient resonance records unfolded through the air in layered projection streams dense with obsolete notation structures and partially untranslated harmonic coding. Selene frowned slightly while reviewing the projections. "I can barely read half of this. Most curators can't. That should concern more people than it does." Bastian glanced toward her briefly. "Yes." The search results expanded further outward through the chamber. Central query, harmonic interruption events, choir lattice irregularities, pre-collapse resonance failures. Thousands of records appeared initially, most irrelevant. Routine drift fluctuations, relay degradation, localized transit collapses. Nothing resembling Benedictio Nonus. Bastian narrowed the search parameters manually, ancient records only. Pre-standardization eras, restricted harmonic classifications. The archive chamber dimmed fractionally around them while deeper systems activated farther beneath the threshold. Selene folded her arms lightly while watching the projections reorganize. "You expected resistance from the modern archives?" "Yes." "You think the Synod suppresses historical anomalies deliberately?" Bastian hesitated, because the truthful answer sounded dangerous even now. "I think institutions survive by editing uncertainty into manageable shapes." Selene looked toward the drifting harmonic records overhead. And you think we've done that before? I think every civilization does. The archive systems finally isolated a smaller cluster of harmonic records. 17 entries, most fragmented, several partially corrupted, one marked inaccessible under obsolete Curator classification authority. Selene stepped closer. What is that? Bastian expanded the oldest accessible file manually. Ancient harmonic projections unfolded slowly across the chamber air. The notation structure differed sharply from modern Curator codification. Denser resonance layering, non-standard synchronization geometry, partially symbolic harmonic references instead of purely mathematical lattice notation. Older than anything Bastian had expected to find intact. The translated header appeared moments later. Regional harmonic interruption. Transient choir absence. Observed. Duration. 0.43 seconds. Containment authorization enacted. Selene stared at the projection. That's impossible. Yes. The word emerged almost automatically now. Not disbelief anymore. Recognition. Bastian expanded the remainder of the file rapidly. Most of the record had been removed, not corrupted, excised. Entire sections terminated mid-sentence beneath later archival authorization markers. One fragment remained partially intact near the lower notation bands. Public disclosure deemed civilizationally destabilizing. Selene read the line twice before speaking. They hid it. Bastian continued searching through the remaining records. Not all of them contained direct references to harmonic interruption, but patterns emerged. Minor lattice instabilities, unexplained relay desynchronization, temporary choir irregularities dismissed as instrumentation error, and every cluster ended the same way. Restricted access, containment authorization, classification review. The silence inside the archive chamber deepened around them, not because the room had grown quieter, because history itself suddenly felt incomplete. Selene looked toward the surrounding projections, slowly rotating through the chamber air. How many people knew about this? Bastian reviewed the authorization structures embedded within the records. Very few. Why preserve the records at all? Because deleting them entirely would create different inconsistencies. Selene exhaled softly. That might be the most Curator thing you've ever said. Bastian almost answered, then stopped. Because another realization had begun forming quietly beneath the first. These records were old, much older than Antiphon Vigil, older than modern Curator authority structures, which meant generations of Curators had inherited evidence that the choir might not be stable, and continued building civilization around it anyway. Bastian felt cold move slowly through him. Not outrage, something worse. Understanding. The archive systems processed one final restricted classification entry near the bottom of the projection lattice. Unlike the others, this file remained fully sealed beneath obsolete authorization structures no longer recognized by modern Curator systems. No accessible contents appeared, only a title. Project Canticle Veil. Selene stared at the projection. What is that? Bastian said nothing, because for the first time since Benedictio Nonus went silent, the fear rising inside him no longer felt entirely connected to collapse. It felt connected to intent. The threshold had begun running out of reassuring explanations. Bastian noticed it first in the pilgrimage concourses. By the beginning of the next cycle, the lower transit sectors had grown crowded far beyond normal operational density. Delayed departures rippled outward through the station faster than the Curators could reorganize schedules, forcing thousands of pilgrims, traders, navigators, and civilian travelers into holding corridors never designed for prolonged habitation. The station still functioned. That was the problem. Nothing had failed dramatically enough to justify panic. Not yet. Instead, the instability spread through delays, interruptions, rerouted corridors, contradictory schedules, and subtle harmonic inconsistencies most civilians could feel emotionally long before they understood them intellectually. The threshold no longer felt balanced. People noticed that even when they lacked language for it. Bastian stood along one of the upper concourse walkways overlooking the primary pilgrimage sectors, while waves of civilian movement continued flowing beneath him through the layered transit halls. The atmosphere below felt wrong, not loud, tense. Conversations remained quieter than usual despite the crowding. Families clustered too closely together near departure gates. Travelers checked transit projections repeatedly even when the displays had not changed. Pilgrims stared toward corridor apertures as though watching for physical signs of instability hidden somewhere inside the harmonic light. Fear moved socially before it moved rationally. The curators understood that, which was why they were still trying to suppress it. Below the walkway, a public synchronization display updated again. Outbound pilgrimage, corridor delayed. Estimated recalibration, window 3.2 hours. The announcement triggered another visible ripple of frustration through the waiting sectors. Not anger, exhaustion. The dangerous stage before anger. Bastian watched one elderly pilgrim quietly lower herself onto a stack of packed transit cases near the edge of the concourse. A younger man beside her continued pretending to study corridor schedules while glancing repeatedly toward the harmonic stabilization fields surrounding the inactive transit aperture. He recognized the behavior immediately. People searching for reassurance in systems they no longer trusted completely. Selene approached from the adjoining concourse ramp several moments later, carrying an armful of updated transit schedules. "You disappeared from the archives without warning. You looked busy. I was looking for you." The answer arrived plainly enough that Bastian looked toward her briefly. Selene distributed the schedules across one of the nearby public relay stations before joining him beside the upper railing overlooking the crowded halls below. The exhaustion in her posture had become harder to hide now. Not physical exhaustion alone. Emotional strain. The threshold's harmonic instability had begun reshaping everyone aboard the station, whether they admitted it or not. "How bad?" Bastian asked quietly. Selene watched the delayed transit corridors below them. 14 major pilgrimage routes delayed. 3 local corridor recalibrations failed overnight. Failed? Temporarily destabilized. Bastian said nothing. The distinction felt institutional rather than meaningful. Below them, curator attendants moved carefully through the concourse, attempting to reassure increasingly restless travelers. Their voices remained calm, measured, controlled. The civilians listened less every hour. A child somewhere in the lower sectors began crying loudly after another corridor delay announcement unfolded across the public displays. The sound carried farther than it should have through the concourse. No one nearby looked comfortable hearing it. Selene rested both hands lightly against the railing. "We're starting to reroute outer sector traffic entirely away from Benedictio Nonus harmonics." Bastian looked toward her sharply. "That much strain redistribution will destabilize neighboring corridors." "I know. And the Synod approved this?" "They approved temporary adaptation protocols." Bastian almost laughed. Temporary. Everything became temporary immediately before institutions admitted permanence. Another harmonic fluctuation passed through the station beneath their feet. Small, but visible this time. The corridor illumination throughout the concourse dimmed unevenly for several seconds before stabilizing again. Nearby transit apertures flickered softly, while harmonic projection fields momentarily distorted along the edges. The entire concourse fell still, thousands of people reacting at once. Not panic, not yet. Something earlier. Recognition. Bastian felt it move through the crowd almost physically. The collective realization that the systems surrounding them were no longer unquestionably reliable. Then the lights stabilized. Movement resumed almost immediately afterward. Too quickly, people continued walking, talking, pretending. But the emotional rhythm of the concourse had changed permanently. A woman below began arguing quietly with one of the curator attendants near a departure checkpoint. "We've been delayed for 11 hours. The corridor requires additional recalibration. You said that 4 hours ago." "The situation remains under review." The woman laughed once under her breath. Not humor, fear disguising itself poorly. Bastian watched the surrounding crowd carefully. People nearby had already stopped pretending not to listen. Rumors spread faster in silence than through announcements. Selene followed his gaze downward. "They still think this can be contained." "Can it?" Selene did not answer immediately. Below them, another outbound corridor dissolved temporarily into unstable harmonic distortion before reforming again several seconds later. This time, several civilians stepped backward visibly when the transit aperture flickered. A few people nearby began gathering their belongings immediately afterward, preparing to move. Even though nowhere aboard the threshold was actually safer, instinct had begun overriding procedure. Selene exhaled softly beside him. The Synod's preparing a formal public statement. When? They haven't decided yet. Bastian looked toward the unstable corridor apertures lining the concourse. That means they're afraid to say the wrong thing. They're afraid panic spreads faster than systems collapse. They may be right. Selene turned toward him slightly. The answer had surprised her. "It happened before," Bastian said quietly. "People don't panic because they're irrational. They panic because they recognize when institutions stop sounding honest." The words lingered between them. Below, the concourse continued shifting slowly toward disorder, despite every effort to preserve calm. Travelers clustered around public relay displays faster than attendants could update them. Pilgrims whispered together beneath dim harmonic lighting. Security personnel appeared near several corridor access points where none had stood the previous day. The threshold still looked orderly, only from a distance. A sudden harmonic pulse moved violently through the station, harder than the earlier fluctuations. The concourse lights failed instantly. Darkness swept across the pilgrimage sectors. Several thousand people inhaled at once. Then the transit apertures failed. Not completely, partially. The harmonic stabilization fields surrounding the corridor gates collapsed into chaotic bands of distorted light before reforming unevenly seconds later. This time, people screamed, only a few at first, then more. Crowds surged backward from the corridor gates almost simultaneously, while public relay systems began flooding the concourse with overlapping recalibration warnings. Curator attendants shouted procedural instructions that vanished beneath rising civilian panic. Bastian gripped the railing instinctively as emergency harmonic systems struggled to stabilize around the failing apertures below. The station lights returned in fractured pulses, flickering, uneven. For several terrible seconds, the entire threshold felt like something struggling to remember how to remain whole. Then stabilization returned. Not fully. Enough. The corridor apertures steadied again beneath emergency harmonic containment fields, while frightened civilians continued pushing away from the transit sectors in waves of confused movement. Security personnel rushed toward the lower concourses. Too late to prevent fear, too late to preserve the illusion. Selene stared down at the crowd below. Neither of them spoke immediately, because both understood what had just happened. The instability was no longer institutional, no longer theoretical. The public had felt it now, and once people physically experienced systems failing beneath them, reassurance alone rarely restored trust afterward. The upper observation galleries had grown quieter since the pilgrimage disruption. Not calmer, avoided. Most station personnel now preferred the crowded operational sectors below where movement and procedure still created the illusion of control. The galleries overlooking the external corridor lattice offered too much visibility into what was happening beyond the threshold, and too much silence between harmonic pulses. Bastian stood alone beside the curved observation glass, while unstable transit corridors flickered faintly through the darkness beyond the station hull. The distortions had become easier to notice now. Not dramatic failures. Subtle irregularities, corridor harmonics brightening too slowly, resonance pathways wavering fractionally before stabilizing, tiny interruptions spreading through the lattice like strain fractures beneath painted metal. Most civilians would still struggle to identify exactly what looked wrong. Their instincts already understood it anyway. Beyond the glass, emergency transit vessels crossed between weakened corridor geometries in carefully spaced intervals, while recalibration beacons glimmered across surrounding sectors like drifting embers suspended inside black water. The threshold no longer resembled a station overseeing stable civilization. It resembled a structure trying not to fall behind catastrophe. Bastian rested one hand lightly against the observation railing. The metal vibrated unevenly beneath his palm. He hated that he recognized the rhythm. Footsteps moved softly through the gallery entrance behind him. He did not turn immediately. Selene stopped several meters away near the edge of the observation chamber. "You left before the stabilization review concluded. They already know the corridors are degrading. That isn't the same as understanding why." Bastian finally looked toward her. The exhaustion between them no longer felt temporary now. The last 2 cycles had stripped away too much certainty too quickly. Selene crossed slowly toward the observation railing beside him, not close enough to touch. Close enough that he remembered wanting to. Below them, one of the weakened corridor apertures flickered visibly across the surrounding darkness before stabilizing again. Selene watched it carefully. That corridor handled 40,000 civilian crossings last month. And now, 8,000. The answer settled heavily between them. Human civilization had not merely expanded through the choir. It had organized itself entirely around the assumption that the choir would never disappear. Trade routes, pilgrimage cycles, food distribution, medical transfers, colonial supply chains. Entire worlds depended on harmonic continuity so completely that most civilians had stopped recognizing it as infrastructure at all. The choir had become reality's architecture, and reality had begun developing fractures. Selene folded her arms lightly against herself while watching the unstable corridor lattice beyond the glass. The Synod's preparing controlled disclosure protocols. Bastian laughed quietly under his breath, a tired sound without humor. Controlled disclosure. "You know what I mean." "Yes," he said. "I do." The words sharpened the silence between them immediately, because both of them remembered Antiphon Vigil too clearly now for euphemisms to remain emotionally neutral. Selene looked toward him carefully. "This isn't the same situation." "No?" "No." Bastian turned fully toward the observation windows again. "The systems are destabilizing. The Synod is delaying disclosure while they search for a version of reality people can survive hearing. They're trying to prevent panic. They said that before, too." Selene's expression tightened slightly. "And people died because panic spread faster than evacuation systems could compensate." Bastian looked toward her sharply. People died because the evacuation began too late. They died because entire sectors collapsed into violence once trust disappeared. They died because institutions trained people to mistake silence for safety. The words echoed more harshly through the gallery than he intended. Selene held his gaze steadily. "And what happens if the Synod announces tomorrow that the choir itself may be failing?" Bastian did not answer immediately, because he had asked himself the same question repeatedly since Benedictio Nonus went silent. What truth could civilization survive hearing all at once? The problem was no longer whether panic would spread. The problem was whether panic was already becoming rational. Outside the observation glass, another corridor fluctuation rippled through the surrounding harmonic lattice. Longer this time, the distortion spread visibly between several transit geometries before slowly correcting itself again. Selene watched the corridor carefully. You think they're lying? I think they're afraid. That isn't the same thing. No, Bastian agreed quietly. It isn't. The answer surprised both of them slightly. Selene exhaled softly. They remember what happened to Antiphon Vigil after your broadcast. Bastian felt something tighten behind his ribs. He remembered too. Crowded transit sectors, emergency corridor overloads, families pushing toward evacuation gates faster than synchronization systems could process movement safely. People trampling each other because fear spread faster than information. And afterward, the tribunal chambers, the silence. Selene looking at him across formal review tiers, while half the curators in the system debated whether truth itself could become criminal under catastrophic enough circumstances. I never wanted people to die, he said quietly. Selene looked toward him immediately. I know. The certainty in her voice hurt more than anger would have, because she believed him. Even now, Bastian stared out toward the unstable corridor lattice beyond the station hull. The worst part, he said after a while, is that they may have learned the wrong lesson from it. Selene remained silent. They think the mistake was disclosure, Bastian continued, not dependence. The threshold vibrated unevenly beneath the gallery floor. Another harmonic pulse passed through the station. Incomplete. The silence afterward lingered too long. Selene rested both hands lightly against the railing. You think civilization became fragile the moment it organized itself around systems it didn't understand? Bastian looked toward her. You don't? Selene hesitated, and for the first time since Benedictio Nonus fell silent, the hesitation itself frightened him, because Selene had always believed stability could be preserved through discipline. Now even she sounded uncertain. Outside the gallery, emergency vessel traffic continued threading carefully between unstable corridor geometries. Tiny lights crossing immense darkness, trying to maintain order inside systems no longer behaving predictably. Selene lowered her gaze briefly toward the observation railing. I used to think your greatest flaw was that you expected collapse everywhere you looked. Bastian almost smiled faintly. And now? Selene lifted her eyes toward the unstable lattice beyond the glass. Now I'm afraid you recognize it faster than the rest of us. The words settled between them quietly. Not accusation. Something worse. Possibility. A violent, harmonic disruption tore suddenly through the station. The gallery lights failed instantly. Darkness crashed across the observation chamber while the threshold shuddered hard enough that the surrounding glass emitted a low metallic groan. This time the silence lasted longer. Far longer. Outside the station hull, 3 major transit corridors vanished simultaneously. Not weakened, gone. The observation windows darkened as harmonic stabilization fields collapsed across the surrounding lattice. Emergency systems struggled to compensate while distant transit beacons flickered erratically through the expanding void beyond the threshold. For several terrible seconds, civilization itself seemed to disappear outside the glass. The gallery remained completely dark except for intermittent emergency pulses flickering across the corridor walls behind them. Bastian heard Selene inhale sharply somewhere beside him. Then the emergency harmonics returned. Partial illumination flooded unevenly back through the gallery, while external stabilization systems attempted to reconstruct the damaged corridor geometries beyond the station. One of the transit pathways slowly reappeared. The other 2 did not. Warning signals erupted across the observation chamber simultaneously. Critical harmonic failure detected. Regional lattice instability expanding. Secondary choir degradation suspected. Bastian stared at the warnings without moving. Cold spread slowly through him. Not shock. Recognition. Because this was no longer isolated failure. The lattice itself had begun unraveling. Beside him, Selene looked toward the still empty regions beyond the observation glass where stable corridors should have remained visible. And for the first time since he had known her, Bastian saw genuine fear overwhelm her composure completely. Neither of them spoke, because both understood the same thing now. The collapse had already begun. The primary synchronization chamber no longer resembled a place designed for order. It resembled exhaustion given architecture. Bastian entered alongside Selene less than 20 minutes after the corridor collapse in the observation galleries. Every operational tier inside the threshold's central resonance complex had filled beyond intended capacity. Analysts crowded around overlapping projection arrays, while emergency synchronization teams moved continuously between failing relay stations, carrying manually isolated harmonic data faster than the station lattice could safely distribute it. The chamber lighting had shifted fully into emergency operational mode. Cold, pale, unforgiving. Above the central tiers, enormous harmonic projections rotated unevenly through the chamber air, displaying widening instability patterns spreading across neighboring sectors. The lattice no longer looked balanced, it looked wounded, and everywhere beneath the procedural movement lingered the same terrible absence. Not one silence now, several. Bastian stopped near the lower synchronization platform while updated harmonic reports unfolded continuously across the surrounding projection fields. Benedictio Nonus, non-responsive. Secondary choir, irregularities. Detected, regional corridor, failures expanding, long-range harmonic stability uncertain. The last line frightened him most. Not because uncertainty existed, because the curators had finally admitted it publicly inside the chamber itself. Selene remained beside him, studying the widening instability patterns rotating overhead. They confirmed secondary degradation. One source partially desynchronized during the gallery failure, answered a nearby verification analyst without looking away from his console. We lost corridor continuity across 3 neighboring sectors for 42 seconds. 42 seconds. Long enough for panic, long enough for ships already inside unstable corridors to disappear permanently. Bastian looked toward the widening resonance fractures spreading outward across the chamber projections. How many transit losses? The analyst hesitated. Unconfirmed, which meant catastrophic. The chamber around them pulsed unevenly as synchronization systems redistributed strain through the remaining harmonic lattice. Projection fields flickered constantly now, while emergency relay calculations updated faster than personnel could fully interpret them. The threshold itself sounded different. The endless harmonic resonance underpinning the station had fractured into uneven, overlapping pulses that no longer fully synchronized with one another. Like hearing civilization breathe irregularly. A new projection unfolded suddenly across the upper chamber tiers. Long-range observatory confirmation received. Multiple non-curator sources verify lattice instability, Meridian Institute data release imminent. A low murmur spread through the chamber. Not surprise, resignation. Containment had ended. Bastian watched several senior curator officials move immediately toward the upper oversight tiers where emergency synod transmissions continued arriving in rapid succession. Too late now. Independent observatories across human space would already be seeing the same failures. The choir could no longer disappear quietly. Selene looked toward the projection fields overhead. They released the data. Bastian nodded once. They had to. Another violent fluctuation moved through the chamber. Several synchronization displays collapsed entirely before emergency systems restored them moments later. Analysts shouted updated relay coordinates across the lower tiers, while harmonic calculations reorganized chaotically through the projection lattice overhead. For the first time since Benedictio Nonus went silent, the threshold's systems no longer appeared fully capable of compensating. The station was falling behind the instability. One of the senior synchronization officials crossed rapidly toward Bastian through the surrounding chamber activity. Supervisor Kane. Bastian turned immediately. The older curator's face looked drained beneath the pale emergency lighting. "We need additional verification on the secondary degradation patterns." "Which source?" The official hesitated, then expanded a restricted harmonic projection directly between them. A second stellar choir designation glimmered faintly within the widening lattice fractures. Status: partial harmonic desynchronization. Bastian stared at the projection silently. Not gone, not yet, but weakening. Exactly as Benedictio Nonus had weakened before the silence. Cold spread slowly through his chest. He understood the pattern now. The choir sources were not failing independently. Something was propagating through the lattice itself. Selene saw the realization appear across his face immediately. "What is it?" Bastian looked toward the widening instability fields rotating above the chamber. "The harmonics are interacting." The official frowned. "That's impossible." "No," Bastian said quietly. "It only should be." The words settled heavily through the surrounding chamber, because impossibility had already stopped functioning as reassurance. Nearby analysts continued processing emergency relay failures while fresh synchronization collapses unfolded sector by sector across the projections overhead. Civilization's nervous system had begun tearing itself apart in real time. One of the lower analysts suddenly looked upward from her console. "Long-range relay collapse in the Perseid sectors." Another voice answered almost immediately afterward. "Outer pilgrimage lattice destabilizing." "Secondary corridor fragmentation confirmed. Civilian traffic rerouting failed." The chamber grew louder for the first time since the crisis began. Not panic, but procedure, approaching panic. The difference was narrowing rapidly. Bastian watched exhausted synchronization personnel struggle to maintain coherent oversight while the lattice projections continued destabilizing above them. No one inside the chamber fully understood what they were looking at anymore. They only understood it was accelerating. A new emergency transmission unfolded suddenly across every major projection field simultaneously. Synod, emergency authorization, public disclosure protocols active. All sector governments notified. Prepare for civilization-wide harmonic disruption response. The chamber fell completely silent afterward. Even the analysts stopped speaking. The words hung motionless across the projection lattice above them. Civilization-wide. Not local, not regional. Civilization-wide. Selene stared upward at the transmission in silence. Bastian watched the surrounding chamber carefully. This was the moment everything changed. Not because the choir had begun failing, because institutions had finally admitted the failure could spread beyond containment. The psychological barrier had broken. One of the exhausted relay analysts near the lower tiers spoke softly before seeming to realize he had done so aloud. "What if the choir is dying?" No one answered him. Because for the first time since the silence began, the question no longer sounded impossible. Only early. Another harmonic fluctuation rolled violently through the threshold. The chamber lights flickered, projection fields distorted. Somewhere deep within the station, emergency stabilization systems began failing loudly enough for the sound to reach the synchronization hall itself. Bastian looked upward toward the widening fractures spreading through the harmonic lattice above the chamber. Tiny distortions, growing absences, the beginning of something civilization had never imagined surviving. And beneath the rising fear moving through the chamber around him, another realization formed slowly with terrible certainty. If the choir truly failed, humanity would not merely lose transit. It would discover how small its civilization had always been without the dead stars carrying it across the dark.